Eleanor Hayes did not cry when Thomas Whitmore looked her over like something he'd ordered by mistake and decided to send back. She stood perfectly still on that sun-scorched platform, gripping the handle of her one-worn suitcase so hard her knuckles turned white, and she did not make a single sound. Not when he walked away. Not when the whispers started. Not when the last train disappeared into the mountains and left her alone with nothing but the hot summer wind and the wreckage of every hope she'd carried for 300 miles. Chapter. If this story is already pulling at your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor remembered that clearly because Tuesdays were laundry days back in Hester, Missouri, and she'd been standing at the washboard with her arms elbow-deep in cold water when Mrs. Aldrich from the post office came hurrying up the path waving an envelope like it contained news from God himself. Eleanor had dried her hands on her apron. She'd taken the letter. She'd read it twice before she let herself believe a single word of it. Dear Miss Hayes, I am a man of considerable means and honest reputation in the territory of Montana. I have been told by mutual acquaintance that you are a woman of strong character, capable hands, and good sense. I am seeking a wife, not a decoration, but a true partner. A good woman like you deserves a proper home. I believe we might build something fine together if you are willing to make the journey west. All travel expenses will be provided. I await your reply with sincere hope. Yours respectfully, Thomas Whitmore. Whitmore Ranch, Callow Creek, Montana Territory. She'd read that phrase 3 times. A good woman like you deserves a proper home. Nobody had ever said that to Eleanor Hayes before. She was 26 years old, and she had been passed over, looked through, and quietly dismissed for most of her life. Not because she was cruel or lazy or dishonest. She was none of those things. She could cook a meal that made grown men close their eyes and sigh. She could mend a torn shirt so neatly you couldn't find the seam. She could stretch a dollar so far it nearly begged for mercy. She had kept her younger brothers fed after their father died and their mother took ill. She had worked without complaint and without thanks for years. But she was plain. People in Hester had decided that early on and never revisited the conclusion. Plain face, plain dress, plain future. That was the box they'd built for Eleanor Hayes, and they'd expected her to live in it quietly until she died in it. Thomas Whitmore's letter blew the lid off that box. She wrote back the same evening. She accepted. She packed everything she owned into one brown leather suitcase that had belonged to her father. She kissed her mother's forehead, hugged her brothers until they complained about it, and she boarded a train heading west with her heart so full of cautious, fragile hope that she was almost afraid to breathe too deeply for fear of disturbing it. The journey took 19 days. She crossed rivers and flatlands and territories that had no names she recognized. She watched the land change through the window, growing wilder, more open, more honest. Somehow, like the farther west you went, the less the land bothered pretending to be something it wasn't. She ate the food she'd packed because she couldn't afford the dining car. She slept sitting up because she couldn't afford a sleeper berth. She arrived in Callow Creek, Montana Territory on a Thursday morning in the first week of July, 1883, with a cramped back and a wrinkled dress and the best smile she could manage after 19 days of hoping. She stepped onto the platform. The summer heat hit her immediately. Not the soft, humid heat of Missouri, but something harder, drier, bright as a blade. The sky above the mountains was the deepest blue she had ever seen in her life. The town spread out from the station in both directions. Rough wooden storefronts and packed dirt roads, horses tied to postmen in wide-brimmed hats, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had decided this territory belonged to them. She looked for Thomas Whitmore. She found him without difficulty. He was the best-dressed man on the platform, pressed dark coat, silver watch, chain boots that had never seen a mud puddle. He was perhaps 45 with silver at his temples and a jaw that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he asked for. He had the kind of face that photographed well. He was already looking at her. That was how she knew immediately that something was wrong, because his face, when he looked at her, did not light up. It did not soften. It did not do any of the things a man's face was supposed to do when he saw the woman he'd sent for across half the continent. Instead, it moved through a series of small controlled expressions: surprise, assessment, disappointment, all in the space of about 3 seconds, and then it settled into something carefully neutral that was somehow worse than all of them. Eleanor kept walking toward him. Her legs kept moving, even though some part of her brain was already shouting at them to stop. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm Eleanor Hayes." "Miss Hayes." He removed his hat. He put it back on. "You've had a long journey." "I have." She waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for exactly. Something. Anything. A hand extended. A smile offered. Some small signal that the man who had written "A Good Woman Like You Deserves a Proper Home" was standing somewhere inside this careful, shuttered face. She didn't find it. What she found instead was Thomas Whitmore's eyes moving slowly, deliberately, with the kind of thorough attention that made her skin feel like it was being catalogued from the top of her head to the worn toes of her shoes and back up again. The whole survey took perhaps 4 seconds. It felt longer. Then he said quietly enough that only she could hear it, "I thought you would look different." The words landed the way cold water does sudden shocking, taking the breath clean out of her. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Your letters were very well written." He said it like that was a consolation. Like good penmanship might offset whatever deficiency her face and figure had revealed. "I formed a certain impression." Eleanor stared at him. An impression of what exactly? He didn't answer that directly. He was already looking past her shoulder toward the other people on the platform, checking, she realized, to see who was watching. To see what Callow Creek was witnessing. Thomas Whitmore standing on a train platform, receiving a woman who did not meet his expectations. "I think," he said slowly, still not looking at her, "that there may have been a misunderstanding about the nature of this arrangement." The air went out of Eleanor's lungs. She had time to think clearly and precisely. "He means he doesn't want me." Not as a thought born of self-pity, but as a plain, factual observation. He had looked at her and made a decision, and was now trying to find words that made him sound less like the man who was about to leave a woman stranded alone in a territory she had never set foot in before. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. "I have certain obligations, my standing in this community." He stopped, started again. "There are people who have expectations about the kind of woman who would be associated with the Whitmore name. And I am not that kind of woman." He finally looked at her directly. And in his eyes, she saw something that was almost worse than cruelty. She saw discomfort. The discomfort of a man who had done something unkind, and was now primarily concerned with his own inconvenience at having to account for it. "I'm sorry you made the journey," he said. "I'll see that you're provided with funds for a return ticket." Then he replaced his hat, straightened his coat, and walked away across the platform with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had concluded his business. Eleanor didn't move. The platform around her was not empty. There were perhaps a dozen people nearby, townsfolk who had come to collect parcels, a family greeting a relative, the station master sorting mail. They had all heard enough. She could tell by the way conversations had paused and eyes had cut toward her before cutting diplomatically away. The whispers started almost immediately. She heard fragments. "Sent for her all the way from Missouri. And well, you can see why he," and a low female laugh that made Eleanor's face go hot from her collar to her hairline. She stood there, and she breathed. She breathed slowly, and she did not cry. She absolutely refused to cry on this platform in front of these strangers who had already decided what she was. She gripped the handle of her father's suitcase until her fingers ached, and she breathed, and she told herself to think. Think. You have always been able to think. She had perhaps $7 left after the train fare. She did not know a single person in this territory. The train she'd arrived on was already gone. She'd heard it pulling away from the platform, while Thomas Whitmore was still talking, which meant the next one heading east wouldn't come until tomorrow morning at the earliest. She needed somewhere to sleep tonight. She needed food. She needed to not collapse in front of these people who were already writing the story of the foolish woman who came 300 miles to be rejected on a platform in front of God and the whole town. She needed to breathe. "Any man who leaves a woman standing alone like that," said a voice, "isn't worth the trouble of watching him go." Eleanor turned. Howe was standing about 10 feet away, leaning against one of the platform posts, with his arms crossed and his hat tilted forward against the summer glare. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that wasn't about posture, but about the actual length of his bones. He wore a working man's clothes, canvas trousers, flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, boots that had seen significant weather. He had a face that looked like it had been left out in the elements long enough to become honest sharp. Jaw, sun-darkened skin, eyes that were a quiet, steady gray. I wasn't looking at her with pity. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing she noticed most. Everyone else on that platform who'd been willing to look at her at all had been looking at her with some version of pity. The polite kind, the smug kind, the uncomfortable kind. This man was looking at her the way you'd look at a person. Not a situation. Not a spectacle. A person. "I don't recall asking for your opinion," Eleanor said. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, but she was past caring about tone at this particular moment. "No, ma'am, you didn't," he agreed without any indication of offense. "I offered it free of charge. You don't have to keep it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" "Caleb Walker." He touched the brim of his hat. "I run a cattle operation about 8 miles north of here, up in the mountain range. I was in town to pick up supplies." "And you felt the need to comment on my business?" "I felt the need to say something true out loud," he said, "because there were a lot of other people on this platform saying things that weren't true, at least not in the ways that matter." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about what just happened here. I know what I saw." "Then you saw that I came here on the basis of letters from a man who apparently had a different picture of what I would be. And that the picture I turned out to be wasn't sufficient. And that I now have nowhere to sleep tonight, and $7 to my name in a territory I have never been to before." She said it flat and plain because she was tired, and because making it into something dignified was more work than she had the energy for right now. "So unless your observation includes some practical solution, Mr. Walker, I'd appreciate if you kept it." Howe was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. Like he'd been expecting her to do something other than what she'd just done. "I have a spare room," he said. "On the ranch. It's nothing fancy. It's where I put the hands during branding season. But it's clean and it's dry and there's food. You're welcome to it until you figure out your next step." Eleanor stared at him. "You don't know me." "No, ma'am. I could be anyone." "That's true. You're offering a room in your home to a complete stranger who just got left on a train platform." "I'm offering a room to a woman who needs one," Caleb Walker said, and his voice was so level, so entirely without drama or ulterior motive, that it was almost disorienting. "What you do with that offer is your business entirely." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She had learned in 26 years of navigating a world that made its assessments of her quickly and rarely revised them to read the difference between kindness offered freely and kindness that came with strings she'd have to spend months untying. She had been fooled before. She intended to be considerably more careful from this point forward. But there was something in this man's gray eyes, something steady and uncomplicated, that she couldn't find a reason to distrust. He wasn't looking at her like she was a problem he wanted to solve for credit. He wasn't looking at her like she was something broken he could fix to his own advantage. He was simply looking at her. "I have $7, she said. "I'll pay you for the room." "You'll keep your $7, he said. "You might need them." "I will not take charity." "It isn't charity." He uncrossed his arms and reached for her suitcase, not grabbing it, just reaching with a questioning look that waited for her permission. "It's a room that was going to sit empty either way. Empty rooms don't do anybody any good." She let him take the suitcase. She told herself it was a practical decision made under practical circumstances, and that was true, and it was also not entirely the whole truth, but she filed that away for later examination and followed Caleb Walker off the platform and into the blinding July afternoon. The wagon was around the side of the station, a solid working vehicle with 2 horses she didn't know the names of yet. Caleb set her suitcase in the bed with the care you'd give something that mattered. He helped her up to the seat with a hand that was steady and then immediately removed itself, no lingering, no presumption. He climbed up on his side and clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved. They were out of Callow Creek before Eleanor remembered to look back. She didn't look back long. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, because silence was fine, but she needed something to do with her mind, other than replay the expression on Thomas Whitmore's face for the 100th time. 11 years, Caleb said. "Built the main house myself. Added the barn the second year. It's not much to look at, but it runs clean." "Do you have hands working it?" "Two. Brothers, Hector and Damon Cole. They sleep in the bunkhouse. The room I'm offering you is in the main house." He said it plainly, no subtext making the distinction clear. "Separate side of the building. Door bolts from the inside." Eleanor looked at him. "You anticipated I might want to know that." Seemed reasonable to say it up front. "Most men don't think about that." "Most men," Caleb Walker said carefully, "haven't paid enough attention." She didn't have an answer for that. She sat with it instead, the way you sit with something unexpected and try to figure out its shape. The road wound north and up. The mountains ahead of them grew less abstract and more present, the peaks sharp against the summer sky. The lower slopes thick with dark timber. The heat was different up here, still intense but cleaner, without the pressing weight of Missouri humidity she'd grown up with. "What brought you to Callow Creek?" Caleb asked after a while. "Besides the letter." Eleanor considered not answering. Then she considered that this man had just offered her a roof and a meal, and refused her money, and made a point of telling her the door locked from the inside, and that seemed to warrant some honesty in return. "I wanted a different life," she said. "That's all. I wanted to go somewhere that didn't already have a conclusion about me before I opened my mouth." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I thought Mr. Whitmore's letter meant that somewhere there was a man who was interested in what a person actually was, rather than how they appeared on first sight." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. "His loss," he said finally. The two words were so quiet and so entirely without performance that Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully, but the way ice cracks in early spring, the way things break apart to let movement happen again. She looked away toward the mountains so he couldn't see her face. They reached the ranch as the afternoon light began to shift gold. She saw it before they fully arrived. A main house built from timber and stone, with a wide covered porch. A large barn that showed evidence of careful ongoing maintenance, fenced pasture, where cattle moved in a slow, purposeful drift. Two men working near the fence line. She assumed the Cole brothers looked up as the wagon came in, looked at Eleanor, looked at each other, and said nothing, which she appreciated. Caleb helped her down from the wagon. "Kitchen's at the back," he said. "I'll get a fire going for supper. Room's on the east side of the house. I'll show you where before it gets dark." "Thank you," Eleanor said. The words felt insufficient, but they were what she had. He nodded once. Then he went to unhitch the horses, and Eleanor stood in front of the house with her father's suitcase and the wreckage of a plan that had seemed so solid 3 weeks ago and now was entirely rubble. She breathed. She squared her shoulders, and she walked up the porch steps and opened the door that was offered to her and stepped into a different life than the one she'd come here expecting. Inside the house was clean, the way a man's house gets when he's the only one cleaning it, functional, with no wasted movement, but missing something soft at the edges. The kitchen was well stocked, she noticed. He bought in quantity, and he bought practical. The table was solid wood built to last. The chairs were unmatched, but all in good repair. She found a kettle, and she put water on. She found flour and salt and a cast iron pan, and she thought about what she could make with what was available, and her hands moved automatically into the patterns she'd been practicing since she was 10 years old. Because there are worse things to do when your heart is in pieces than cook something that will sustain another person. Caleb came in an hour later and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. He looked at the table. She'd found a cloth in a drawer and pressed it flat. The food she'd made from what he had on hand, biscuits, fried pork, dried apple compote, was nothing extraordinary, but it was set out properly with attention. He looked at the table for a long moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You gave me a place to sleep," Eleanor said. "I gave you supper. It seems equitable." He came and sat down. He picked up his fork. He took a bite of the biscuit. I was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd done something wrong. Misjudged the salt or the baking time. And then he said without looking up, "That's the best biscuit I've had in 11 years. Eleanor sat down across the table from him. "That's a very specific timeline." "I made them myself until tonight," he said, "and I know what they tasted like." She almost smiled. She wasn't ready to smile yet, not fully, but almost. They ate together in a silence that was more comfortable than it had any right to be between two strangers and outside the window. The summer sky over the mountains burned orange and then red, and then deepened into the first quiet blue of evening, and Eleanor Hayes, who had come 300 miles to be turned away at a train platform, sat at a plain wooden table in a mountain man's kitchen, and felt for reasons she couldn't yet fully explain, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The feeling frightened her a little. She decided that was probably appropriate. After supper, Caleb showed her the room on the east side of the house. It was simple, a wood frame bed with a wool blanket, a washstand, a window that looked toward the mountains. The bolt on the door was solid iron. "If you need anything in the night," he said from the doorway, "holler. I sleep light." "I won't need anything," Eleanor said. He nodded. "Then I'll see you in the morning." He started to pull the door closed, then stopped. "Miss Hayes." She looked at him. "Whatever you decide to do from here," he said. "Whatever your next step is, there's no clock on it. Take the time you need." He pulled the door closed. His footsteps crossed the main room, and she heard his bedroom door close on the far side of the house. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She sat there for a long time, not sleeping, just sitting, listening to the sounds of the mountain ranch settling into night, the low sound of cattle, the creak of cooling timber, the wind that had begun to move through the pines outside her window with a sound like breathing. She had come west for a life she had imagined carefully. The life she had found looked nothing like the one she'd planned. But in the dark, in the quiet, with the mountain wind outside, and the smell of the supper she'd cooked still faintly in the air, Eleanor Hayes made herself one promise. She was not going home. She was not going to let Thomas Whitmore's face, that careful, shuttered, assessing face, be the last word on her story. She had crossed half a country. She had stood on a platform and absorbed a humiliation that would have flattened a lesser woman. She had walked into a stranger's home with $7 and a worn leather suitcase, and she had found the kitchen, and she had put a cloth on the table, and she had made the best biscuits that kitchen had seen in 11 years. She could do more than that. She intended to. She lay down on the wool blanket. She closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain wind kept breathing through the pines, and the stars over the Montana territory blazed enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And Eleanor Hayes went to sleep with her jaw still set and her hands still steady, and something new and complicated stirring in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. She was awake before sunrise, not because something woke her, no sound, no disturbance, but because Eleanor Hayes had spent enough years sleeping lightly in houses where she was needed before dawn, that her body had simply stopped expecting rest to last. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, locating herself, remembering where she was and how she'd gotten there. Then she got up. She found the kitchen by memory, moving carefully through the dark house. She found the stove, found the kindling box, found the matches on the shelf where any sensible person would keep matches beside the lamp close to the stove. She built a fire. She found the coffee. She put water on. By the time Caleb Walker appeared in the doorway, the coffee was ready, and Eleanor was standing at the work table assessing what he had in the way of provisions and making a mental list of what was missing. He stopped in the doorway. He was dressed already, working man's clothes, boots, hat in hand, which told her he was also a person accustomed to rising before the light required it. He looked at the fire and the coffee, and Eleanor standing at his work table, like she'd been doing it for years, and his expression shifted through something she couldn't quite read before settling back into its usual quiet neutrality. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You said that last night," Eleanor replied. "I'll tell you the same thing I didn't say last night. I understand I didn't have to. I chose to." He came in and poured himself a cup of coffee. He took a sip. He said nothing for a long moment, which she was starting to understand was not rudeness, but simply how he operated. He thought before he spoke, and he didn't speak until the thinking was done. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "Well enough." She turned back to her inventory of his provisions. "Mr. Walker, you have no dried fruit, no molasses, no vinegar, no dried herbs of any kind, and your flour supply is adequate but only just. I'd like to know what day you usually go into town for supplies." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Fridays. Why?" "Because I'm making a list." She found a pencil stub on the shelf and a scrap of brown paper and began writing. "If I'm going to be using your kitchen, I'd prefer to use it correctly." There was a pause. "You planning on staying a while, Miss Hayes?" he asked, and his voice carried no particular weight in any direction, not hope, not reluctance, just the question. Eleanor set down the pencil and looked at him squarely. "I told myself last night that I wasn't going home. I meant it. I don't know yet what staying looks like, or what I can offer this ranch in practical terms. But I know I can cook and manage a household, and I know I don't take up much space, and I know I pull my weight. If that's useful to you, I'd like to discuss terms. If it's not, I'll make other arrangements. But either way, I am not getting on the eastbound train." Caleb Walker put down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment, that same steady assessing look that she'd noticed at the station, the one that was somehow completely different from the way Thomas Whitmore had assessed her, because this one wasn't measuring deficiency. It was measuring something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet. "I've got 60 head of cattle," he said. "2 hired hands who eat like they're each feeding a second person. A bunkhouse that needs its chimney remortared before winter. A root cellar that nobody's properly organized since I built this place. And a garden on the east side of the house that's been growing more weeds than food for the last 3 summers, because I don't have enough hours in a day to manage everything that needs managing." He picked up his coffee again. "Can you do any of that?" Eleanor picked up the pencil. "Which first?" Something moved in the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of one. "Garden," he said, "before it's a total loss." That was how Eleanor Hayes's first morning on the Walker Ranch began. Not with terms negotiated or wages discussed, or any of the formal arrangements she'd half expected, but with a cup of coffee and a list, and a man who communicated primarily by saying things that were direct and true, and expected you to respond in kind. She found she didn't mind that at all. The Cole brothers arrived from the bunkhouse shortly after sunrise. Hector was there, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a mustache and the weathered hands of a man who'd been working cattle since before he was fully grown. Damon was younger by perhaps 3 years, lighter in build, with a quick, watchful face and eyes that missed very little. They both stopped short when they saw Eleanor in the kitchen. Hector looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at his coffee. "Miss Hayes is going to be staying on for a while," Caleb said. "She'll be managing the household. You'll treat her with the same respect you'd want shown to your own mother, or I'll hear about it, and you won't like the hearing." Hector removed his hat. "Yes, sir." Damon had already removed his. "Morning, ma'am." Eleanor set plates in front of them. She'd made biscuits again. She'd found herself making them almost automatically, the recipe living in her hands rather than her head, along with fried eggs and the last of what turned out to be a very adequate side of bacon. Damon took one bite of the biscuits and looked up at his brother. Hector looked down at his plate and then back up with the expression of a man who had been eating Caleb Walker's cooking for 2 years and had just been reminded what food was supposed to taste like. "Ma'am," Damon said carefully, "how long did you say you were planning to stay?" "I didn't say," Eleanor replied, pouring coffee. "Eat your breakfast before it gets cold." The morning moved fast after that. Caleb was in the pasture before she'd finished the dishes, working with the Cole brothers on something involving the fence line on the north side. Eleanor could hear their voices occasionally. Caleb's low and measured, Hector's rumbling affirmation. Damon's occasional quick question, but she didn't have attention to spare for listening. She had the garden. The garden was, to put it charitably, a disaster. Whoever had started it had known what they were doing. The beds were laid out sensibly, with decent drainage and good sun exposure. But 3 summers of neglect had turned it into a battlefield where the weeds were winning decisively. She found tomato plants so crowded by thistle they'd gone spindly and pale. She found carrot tops that had bolted and gone to seed. She found onions struggling through ground that hadn't been turned in far too long. She got on her knees and she went to work. She worked through the morning heat, without stopping, pulling and turning and transplanting and muttering under her breath about what could be saved and what was a lost cause, and which of the weeds were the kind that came back twice as determined if you didn't get the root. Her hands were black with dirt by 8 o'clock. Her back was aching by 9. She didn't stop. At some point she became aware that she wasn't alone. She looked up from a particularly stubborn thistle root and found Caleb standing at the edge of the garden watching her. Not in a way that felt like surveillance, more the way a person stops and looks when they see something they weren't expecting. "You've been at that for 3 hours, he said. "Yes." She went back to the thistle. "In the full sun." "I'm aware of where the sun is, Mr. Walker." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he crouched down on the other side of the bed and pulled up a thistle of his own. Just like that, without asking, without making a thing of it. They worked side by side for a while without speaking. "These tomatoes can probably be saved," Eleanor said eventually. "If they get enough water and light now, they'll catch up. The carrots are a loss. The onions are borderline." "I'll plant whatever you say to plant," Caleb said. "You're very accommodating for a man who didn't ask me to stay." He looked up. "You needed somewhere." "I had somewhere. That's accommodating." "Most people would have pointed me toward the boarding house." "There isn't a boarding house in Callow Creek. There's a hotel that costs $3 a night and is run by a man named Garrett, who'd have you charged double by the end of the week because he'd know you had nowhere else to go." He pulled another thistle clean from the root. "I didn't point you there." Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Why not?" He met her eyes. The summer light was direct and unsparing, and in it she could see more of his face than she had the day before. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the steadiness in them that wasn't blankness, but something more like patience, worn down to its essential weight. "Because I've seen what happens," he said, "when people take advantage of someone who's already been knocked down. I don't have any interest in being part of that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, a small movement, and turned back to the garden. They didn't talk about it again. But something shifted between them in the rows of that struggling garden, something small and significant. The way the first crack in ice sounds like almost nothing and changes everything. By Friday of the first week, Eleanor had the garden producing again. The root cellar reorganized, the kitchen inventory tripled, and a routine that fit the ranch's rhythms so precisely that it felt like she'd been doing it for months rather than days. She woke before sunrise. She had coffee ready when Caleb came in. She managed 3 meals a day for 4 people on a budget that would have made her Missouri neighbors weep with envy, and produced food that made Hector Cole look genuinely emotional at least twice. She was good at this. She'd always been good at it. That was the particular cruelty of the box people had built for her in Hester. She had always been capable and organized and excellent at the practical business of keeping people fed and housed and comfortable, and not one person had thought to wonder whether she might deserve more than a quiet life being useful to people who barely noticed her. On this ranch, people noticed. Damon asked her on Wednesday if she could teach him to make biscuits, because he explained earnestly he planned to homestead his own land eventually, and a man who could feed himself had an advantage. She taught him. He was a poor student, but enthusiastic. Hector thanked her for supper every single evening, with a gravity that suggested he meant it as a genuine expression of gratitude, rather than politeness, which Eleanor found she was moved by in ways she didn't examine too closely. And Caleb. Caleb Walker noticed everything she did, and commented on almost none of it, and that absence of comment was somehow more eloquent than praise, because it said, "I see this as simply what you are not as a performance I need to evaluate." She was dangerous territory, that realization. She tried not to spend too much time in it. On Friday, Caleb drove into Callow Creek for supplies, and Eleanor went with him. She had her list. She had her $7, which she intended to contribute to the provision budget over his continued objection. She also had tucked somewhere beneath her practical intention to purchase flour and vinegar and dried herbs. A small, complicated awareness that she would have to pass through the town that had watched Thomas Whitmore walk away from her on a platform 5 days ago. She sat straight on the wagon seat. Caleb didn't say anything until they were nearly to town, and then he said, "If anyone says something that needs answering, you don't have to answer it." "I'm aware. I meant I'll answer it." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "Mr. Walker, I have been answering for myself since I was 16 years old. I don't require a spokesman." "No," he agreed. "You don't. I just meant I'd be there." She looked away. "Thank you," she said after a moment. They reached Callow Creek, and the first person who saw Eleanor and put it together was a woman named Martha Teague, who ran the dry goods store and apparently considered herself the memory and conscience of the town simultaneously. She looked at Eleanor over the counter with the particular expression of a woman who had witnessed the platform incident, filed it carefully, and was now calculating what Eleanor's reappearance implied. "Miss Hayes," she said, "I didn't expect to see you still in Callow Creek." "Here I am," Eleanor said, and set her list on the counter. Have you made other arrangements?" The question was polite on the surface and something considerably less polite underneath. "I'm working on the Walker Ranch," Eleanor said. "Managing the household. Mr. Walker, could you grab the flour from the back shelf? I believe it's the large sacks." She heard Martha Teague process this. She could almost hear the recalibration happening, the woman's expression, moving from social curiosity to something more guarded, because Caleb Walker was. Eleanor had gathered quickly, a man whose regard carried weight in this community. Not because he sought social standing, he plainly did not, but because 11 years of consistent, honest dealing had built a reputation that the town had decided was worth respecting. Being under his roof changed what Eleanor was in Callow Creek's accounting. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Part of her was grateful for the protection of it. Part of her was irritated that protection was necessary. She settled, as she often did, for filing the feeling away and getting on with the list. They were loading the last of the supplies into the wagon when it happened. Thomas Whitmore came out of the bank. He saw Eleanor before she saw him, which meant she didn't have the advantage of preparation. She only knew he was there because she heard his footsteps stop and looked up and found him standing 6 feet away with his hat in his hand and an expression on his face that she hadn't expected. He looked not sorry exactly. Men like Thomas Whitmore rarely looked sorry, but he looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who had done something he was beginning to find inconvenient. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor folded the top of a flour sack closed with precise, deliberate hands. I understand you've found a situation with the Walker Ranch." He said it like it was a question that wasn't quite a question. "That's correct." "I'm glad to hear it. I want to say that I hope there are no hard feelings about the situation at the station." Eleanor looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She thought about all the possible responses available to her. She thought about the 19 days on the train. She thought about standing on that platform with her knuckles white on her father's suitcase and the whispers going around her like water around a stone. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you made your assessment very clearly. I made mine. I don't think either of us has anything to add to that conversation." He blinked. He'd been expecting, she suspected, either tears or forgiveness, because those were the two responses women were supposed to offer men who treated them badly, and she was offering him neither. "Yes," he said. "Well, good day, Miss Hayes." "Good day," Eleanor said. He walked away. Caleb had appeared at her shoulder at some point during the exchange. She hadn't noticed him arrive, only that he was there. He waited until Whitmore was clear of earshot, and then he said very quietly, "You all right?" "Perfectly fine," Eleanor said. He looked at her sideways. "He expected me to cry or thank him," she said. "I did neither. That'll bother him more than anything I could have actually said." A pause. Then, for the first time since she'd known him, Caleb Walker smiled, a real one. Not the almost smile she'd seen before, but something actual, something that changed his whole face and made him look briefly like someone much younger than the man who'd been living alone on a mountain for 11 years. Eleanor looked away, before she did anything foolish with that information. They drove home in the afternoon heat, the wagon loaded and the horses moving at their patient, steady pace, and Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and her supply list folded into her pocket, and something that wasn't quite settled happening in the region of her chest. She told herself it was the heat. The second week brought a problem. Hector Cole came in from the north pasture on Tuesday afternoon, looking grim in a way that was different from his usual measured seriousness. And he and Caleb went into the main room and talked in voices too low for Eleanor to make out the words. But she could hear the timbre of the conversation, and it was a timbre she recognized from a lifetime of listening at the edges of men's serious discussions. Something was wrong. She carried in coffee without being asked and set it on the table, and neither of them sent her away, which she took as permission to stay. What she learned from the pieces she assembled from Hector's direct statements and Caleb's shorter, darker responses was this: the water source for the north pasture was being systematically blocked. 3 times in the past 2 weeks the creek that fed the northern grazing land had been diverted. The first time they'd thought it was debris. The second time they'd thought it was debris from the same storm. The third time had been too deliberate to mistake. "Someone's doing it on purpose," Hector said. "I know." Caleb's voice was flat, not surprised, not afraid, flat in the way that suggested he'd been expecting something like this for longer than today. "Whitmore's land is north of the creek," Hector said. Caleb didn't respond to that directly. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table and was quiet for long enough that Eleanor could feel the weight of what he was deciding not to say out loud. "I'll fix the diversion in the morning," he said finally, "and I'll ride the fence line again." "Third time in 2 weeks," Hector said quietly. "I know." Hector looked at Eleanor not accusingly, but like a man checking whether the civilian in the room understood what was happening. Eleanor returned the look steadily. She understood exactly what was happening. Thomas Whitmore had been embarrassed. A woman he'd rejected had taken up residence at his nearest neighbor's ranch and looked more comfortable there than she'd ever looked waiting on his platform, and men like Thomas Whitmore did not tolerate embarrassment gracefully. And if Whitmore had decided that Caleb Walker needed to be reminded of his limitations, a man alone on a mountain ranch with 60 head of cattle and 2 hired hands and no legal resources, Eleanor could yet identify, then water was a very practical place to start the reminder. After Hector went back to the bunkhouse, Eleanor cleared the cups from the table. She worked quietly, and she thought, and she let the thinking come to its point before she spoke. "Mr. Walker?" Caleb was still at the table. He hadn't moved. "Is this about the land?" she asked. He looked up. "The water issue," she said. "Is this part of something larger? Something about the north pasture land specifically?" A long pause. "Why would you ask that?" "Because 3 deliberate diversions in 2 weeks isn't harassment," she said. "It's a strategy. Someone is trying to make that pasture useless to you. And useless land is land. Someone else can argue claim to, especially if the reason for the diversion is never documented, and the neighboring landowner has enough money and standing to make the argument convincingly." Caleb was very still. "How do you know about land disputes?" he asked. "I grew up watching my father fight one for 6 years," Eleanor said. "He lost. I paid attention to why." Another pause, longer this time. "There's been interest," Caleb said carefully, "in the north acreage, for the past year. I've had 2 written offers, both declined. The water, yes. If the cattle can't graze the north pasture through summer, I'll have to reduce the herd. A smaller operation is a more vulnerable one." "And you have no documentation of the diversions?" "No." "You do now," Eleanor said. "I'm writing it down. Date, time, extent of diversion, estimated impact. If it happens again, I'll have a record that goes back to the beginning. That's not nothing in a territorial court." Caleb looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't entirely decipher. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was something more like recognition, like a man seeing something come into focus that had been blurry at the edges. "Miss Hayes," he said. "You gave me a roof," she said. "I'll give you what I'm able to." She found paper. She wrote down everything Hector had said, and the 2 previous incidents as Caleb recounted them from memory dates, locations, what they'd found, how it had been remedied. She made 2 copies. One she kept in the kitchen where she could add to it. One she gave to Caleb. He held it in his hands for a moment before folding it and putting it in his coat pocket. I didn't say thank you. But the way he held the paper carefully like it mattered said it for him. The 3rd week changed things. Not dramatically. Not the way a gunshot changes things, or a fire changes things. The way a season changes gradually, then all at once, and when you looked back, you couldn't point to the exact day it happened. Eleanor had been mending one of Caleb's work shirts. She'd found it at the bottom of a trunk torn along the shoulder seam and folded away like something given up on. And she was sitting on the porch in the late evening working on it when Caleb came and sat in the other chair. He had a cup of coffee even at this hour, which told her something about the relationship between him and sleep. He sat and she mended, and the mountain dark came on around them with its enormous stars and its clean-smelling wind. "Why'd you come west?" he asked after a while. "I told you, I wanted a different life." "What kind of different?" She considered. "The kind where someone saw me before they decided what I was." She pulled the thread through. "Where I was allowed to be more than what was convenient." He was quiet for a moment. "What made you think Montana would be that Thomas Whitmore's letter?" She laughed a little, not a happy sound but a real one. "Which turned out to be based on the misunderstanding about what kind of person I was, which is almost funny when you think about it." "It isn't funny." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She finished a row of stitching. "What about you? You said you built this place 11 years ago. You were what, 27? 26. That's young to decide to live alone on a mountain." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones they'd shared before, heavier with something under it. "I didn't come up here to be alone," Caleb said finally. "I came up here with my wife." Eleanor's hands stilled on the mending. "She died," he said. "Second winter. Fever came fast." He looked out at the dark. "I built the house for 2 people. I've been living in it alone for 9 years." Eleanor sat very still. She understood suddenly why the house had felt the way it did when she walked into it, clean and functional, and carefully maintained and utterly absent of warmth. Not because Caleb Walker was a cold man, but because he was a man who had loved someone and lost her, and had spent 9 years not letting himself fill the space she'd left. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." Then after a moment, "I mean, yes, thank you. But I don't need—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for me." "I know." She went back to the mending because she understood instinctively that looking at him right now would be too much. "You're telling me so I'll understand the house." He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to respond at all. "Yes," he said quietly. "Something like that." They sat together in the dark for another hour, not talking much, and when Eleanor finally went inside, she stood for a moment in the empty kitchen and looked at the table where 4 people now ate 3 times a day, and the stove that now burned every morning, and the shelf where the herbs she'd bought in town last Friday stood in a row, bringing color and smell into a space that had been without either for 9 years. She thought about what it meant to fill a space. She thought about whether filling a space could happen without taking something from the person who'd kept it empty. She didn't have an answer. But she was still asking the question, which was more than she'd expected of herself 2 weeks ago on a train platform, with her knuckles white and her heart in splinters. She was still asking it on Friday morning, when Damon Cole came running in from the north pasture faster than she'd ever seen either of the brothers run, and burst through the kitchen door with his hat gone and his face the color of old ash, and said, "Ma'am, there's men on the north fence, 4 of them, armed." Eleanor put down what she was holding. "Where's Mr. Walker?" she said. "Caleb's already there." Damon was breathing hard. "He's alone up there, ma'am. Hector's on the south side repairing the gate, and he hasn't heard yet." He hesitated, and in his eyes she saw something that made her chest go tight, not just urgency, but real fear. "The men, one of them works for Whitmore. I've seen his face in town." Eleanor looked at the door. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at her hands. Then she took off her apron. "Go get Hector," she said. Now, I'm going to the north fence. Ma'am, you can't. I'm going, she said, and the tone of her voice closed the argument so decisively that Damon blinked and simply nodded and ran. Eleanor walked out of the kitchen and across the yard and toward the north pasture, with her heart hammering and her chin level, and her mind working through everything she knew about land disputes and armed men, and what documentation could and couldn't do when the situation moved faster than paperwork. She had been on this ranch for 3 weeks. She had come here with nothing. But she was not. She had decided this on a train platform with her knuckles white and her dignity intact, and she had not revised it since she was not the kind of woman who stayed inside and waited to find out what had happened to someone who had given her a roof and treated her like a person. The north fence wasn't far, but it felt like a very long walk. She heard the voices before she reached the fence. Not words, not yet, just the shape of voices. The particular register of men who had come somewhere with the intention of making a point and were in the process of making it. She'd heard that register before. Her father had faced it twice in the 6 years he'd spent fighting over water rights in Missouri, and both times it had ended badly for him. She walked faster. When she cleared the tree line, she saw them. 4 men on horseback positioned along the north fence line in a way that looked casual and was not. 2 of them she didn't recognize. Large, deliberate men with the specific stillness of people being paid to stand somewhere and look convincing. The third was the one Damon had mentioned, a man named Cord Reeves, who rode for Whitmore and had the hard, weathered face of someone who'd been doing this kind of work long enough that he'd stopped thinking much about it. The fourth was Caleb, who was on the ground, not mounted, standing at the fence with his arms at his sides. She knew him well enough by now. 3 weeks was enough if you paid attention, and she had paid meticulous attention to read the set of his shoulders from 40 yards away. He was controlled. He was furious underneath the control in the way of a man who has decided that losing his temper would cost him more than he could afford. Cord Reeves was doing the talking. "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to make a very fair offer," Reeves said, and his voice had the smooth, patient quality of a man reciting something he'd been told to say. "Given the current challenges you're experiencing with the North acreage, a full buyout at assessed value would solve a considerable number of problems." "The North acreage isn't for sale," Caleb said. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without decoration. But the quietness had an edge today. "That's a shame." Reeves shifted in his saddle. "Because if the water situation continues—" "The water situation," Caleb said, "is being documented." That stopped Reeves for a moment. A small stop, barely visible, but Eleanor caught it because she was watching everything carefully and had come to understand that the small stops were where the truth lived. "Documented," Reeves repeated. "Date, time, method, extent of diversion. 3 incidents, all recorded." Caleb's voice was absolutely level. "I'll be filing that record with the Territorial Land Office in Helena by end of month." Reeves looked at his 2 companions. Something passed between them. Not words, just the quick flicker of men recalculating. "That seems like a lot of trouble," Reeves said finally, "over a water issue that's probably just natural causes." 3 times in 2 weeks, Caleb said. "Same location, same method. That's not natural. You know it, and I know it, and whoever you're reporting back to tonight will know that I know it." That was the moment Eleanor arrived at the fence. She didn't stop. She walked right through the gap in the rails where Caleb had clearly come through, and she positioned herself beside him, not behind him, beside him, and she pulled the folded document from her skirt pocket and held it in her hand where it was visible. Reeves looked at her. His expression was the particular expression of a man who had shown up expecting 1 opponent and found 2. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had gone careful. "This is a business matter." "I'm aware," Eleanor said. "I'm the one who compiled the documentation Mr. Walker just mentioned. 3 incidents. Dates, locations, estimated water loss, estimated impact on cattle capacity." She held up the paper. "I also have a written account from Hector Cole, who witnessed the 2nd incident, and from Damon Cole, who was present when the 3rd diversion was discovered." She had written those accounts this morning. She hadn't known why exactly, just that it had felt necessary, and she had learned to trust that feeling. "That's 3 corroborating witnesses in addition to Mr. Walker." Reeves was very still. If this goes to the land office, Eleanor continued, what you have is a pattern. And a pattern documented and witnessed is the kind of thing territorial commissioners find considerably more interesting than a single complaint. She folded the paper back. I thought Mr. Whitmore's representative should be aware of that. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a moment that has shifted on its axis, and everyone present knows it, but nobody has moved yet. Caleb said nothing. He stood beside her with his arms still at his sides, and she was aware of him the way you're aware of something solid when you're standing somewhere precarious, not leaning on it, but knowing it's there. Reeves looked at the paper in her hand for a long moment. Then he straightened in the saddle. Mr. Whitmore's offer stands, he said, but the smooth patience had gone out of his voice. It was just words now, a script being read by a man who had lost the thread of the scene. If you change your mind. I won't, Caleb said. Reeves touched the brim of his hat at Eleanor, not at Caleb, which she noticed, and pulled his horse around. The other three followed. She watched them go until they were well past the tree line, and the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the summer heat. Then her hands started shaking. She made them stop. She pressed them flat against her skirt, and breathed, and made them stop by sheer will, because she was not going to shake in front of Caleb Walker after she'd just finished being the most composed person in a field. She was not entirely successful. Caleb looked at her hands. He didn't comment on them. You came out here, he said. You were alone. I can handle 4 men and a land dispute that's heading toward a territorial filing, Eleanor said. You could handle 3 of those things. The 4th required someone who'd read enough legal proceedings to know which words to say in which order. She finally tucked her hands together in front of her to give them somewhere to be. I read a great deal. He looked at her for a long moment. His face did the thing it sometimes did when she surprised him, that almost invisible recalibration, something shifting behind his eyes. Where'd you get the Cole brothers' written accounts? He asked. You said, I wrote them this morning. She met his gaze evenly. I asked Hector and Damon to tell me what they'd seen, and I wrote it down and they signed it. I didn't know we'd need it today. I thought we should have it. You thought we should have it, he repeated. It seemed prudent. Another long look. Then quietly, thank you, Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She had been Miss Hayes for 3 weeks, always. Miss Hayes, respectful and proper and correct. And the shift was so small, it should have meant almost nothing, and somehow meant considerably more than that. She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say anything else right then. Hector arrived at a hard run 2 minutes later, out of breath and holding his rifle, and stopped short when he found them both standing at the fence in what was apparently perfect calm. They gone? He demanded. They're gone, Caleb said. Hector looked from Caleb to Eleanor and back. Damon said there were 4 of them. There were, Eleanor said. And you. Hector looked at her with something in his face that wasn't quite disbelief, and wasn't quite awe, but was in the general territory of both. Damon said you just walked out here. Someone had to, Eleanor said. Hector stood there for a moment processing this. Then he put his rifle down and took his hat off and held it against his chest. Ma'am, he said solemnly, you are something else entirely. Eleanor permitted herself a small smile. I'm going to start lunch. She walked back to the house with her hands steady and her spine straight and the document folded back in her pocket, and she didn't let herself think about what had just happened until she was safely alone in the kitchen with the door closed and the fire going. And then she sat down in the chair by the stove for exactly 2 minutes and allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. The fear she hadn't shown the shaking. She'd controlled the specific terror of walking toward 4 armed men on horses, because the alternative was staying inside while something happened to the one person in this territory who had treated her like she was worth something. 2 minutes. Then she stood up and started lunch. That evening, after the Cole brothers had retired to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Caleb came and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and a look on his face that she'd come to recognize as his version of having something to say and taking the time to find the right words for it. She waited. Whitmore isn't going to stop, he said. I know. The documentation helps, but a man with enough money and enough motivation can work around documentation if he's patient and the law is slow. Then we need the law to move faster, Eleanor said. She'd been thinking about this all afternoon through lunch and the afternoon chores and the supper she'd made almost without conscious attention because her mind was working a different problem. The Territorial Land Commissioner's Office handles water rights disputes. If you file before Whitmore does, you control the narrative. She turned from the stove. Do you have your original land grant papers? Your water rights documentation from when you filed the claim? In the strongbox, yes. I'd like to look at them. He brought them out without hesitation, which told her something about how far they'd come from the man who'd offered a stranger a spare room and carefully told her the door locked from the inside. He spread the documents on the kitchen table, and Eleanor bent over them and read carefully, tracing the language with one finger, the way her father had taught her. Read the words, not the story you think they're telling. What she found made her sit down. Caleb. She looked up. Your water rights document the creek that feeds the north pasture. It says here the water access was established in 1871. When did Whitmore buy his land? Caleb's eyes sharpened. 73. So his land was purchased 2 years after your water rights were established and recorded? Yes. Then any diversion of that creek constitutes interference with a prior legal claim. She pressed her finger to the relevant line. This isn't a dispute between equal parties. This is a violation of an established right. The language here, Caleb, this is very clear. If this goes to a territorial commissioner with your documentation and the dates of the 3 diversions. Whitmore isn't just going to lose the North Acreage dispute. He's going to be facing potential legal action for the interference. Caleb stood very still over the documents. He read the passage she was pointing to. He read it again. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and put both hands flat on the table and looked at the document with the focused expression of a man whose entire posture has changed because what was standing on one side of a line a moment ago is now standing on a completely different side. I didn't know, he said. I've never needed a lawyer. He stopped. I read the document when I filed it. I thought the water access was I thought it was part of the land claim. I didn't know what it meant in terms of legal protection. My father didn't know either, Eleanor said quietly. He had a water rights document that would have won his case in 3 months, and he spent 6 years losing a land dispute because nobody told him to read the language carefully. She looked down at the papers. I read everything I could find after he lost. Legal proceedings, land office filings, territorial court records. I thought maybe if I understood it well enough, I could find something that would... She stopped. He died before I could do anything with it. But I kept reading. The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor. Caleb's voice was low. I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man. She straightened the documents carefully, aligning the edges. He just didn't know what his papers said. You knew what mine said. I read them this morning, when I was writing down the Cole brothers' accounts. She folded her hands on the table. I read everything in this house. I hope you don't mind. He looked at her for a long moment, and the look was the same one he'd had in the garden on that first morning and at the platform in Callow Creek. And tonight, when he'd said her name for the first time, that look of a man who has stopped being surprised and started simply watching with the particular attention of someone who has realized they are in the presence of something that keeps revealing itself to be more than he expected. I don't mind, he said. She filed the territorial claim 2 days later. Caleb drove her to Callow Creek to the small office of the Territorial Land Commissioner's local representative, a tired-looking man named Avery Birch, who spent most of his professional life dealing with mining claims and grazing disputes, and seemed genuinely startled when Eleanor set a complete documented legally cited water rights interference complaint on his desk and looked at him steadily. This is thorough, Birch said, going through the papers. Yes, Eleanor said. He looked up at her over his spectacles. You write like someone who's read a lot of legal documents. I have. He went back to the papers. The prior claim date is solid, and 3 documented incidents with 2 additional witnesses that's stronger than most of what comes across this desk. He looked at Caleb. Mr. Walker, I'll need to forward this to the commissioner's office in Helena. It'll take 2 to 3 weeks for a response. In the meantime, I'd recommend continuing your documentation of any further incidents." "We will," Eleanor said. Birch looked at her again, then at Caleb, then back at her. "Is this your—" "She manages the ranch household," Caleb said. "She also apparently knows more about territorial water law than I do." Birch almost smiled. "I'll file this today," he said. They walked out of the land office into the July afternoon, and Caleb stopped on the boardwalk and looked out at the street, and Eleanor stood beside him and waited. "What happens now?" he said. "Now we wait," she said. "And we keep documenting. And we don't let Whitmore's men touch that creek again without a witness. And if he sends men again like Friday—" Eleanor looked at him. "Then we go together." He turned his head and looked at her, and there was something in his face right now that was different from anything she'd seen there before, softer than his usual steadiness. Something that had gotten past the careful distance he maintained the way. A gate gets left unlatched, not broken, just open. He looked away before either of them had to do anything about it. "We should get back," he said. "Yes," she said. They got back. The next 2 weeks moved differently. The filing had changed something not in what was happening around the ranch, because Whitmore's pressure didn't stop, but in how Caleb and Eleanor moved through it together. There was no longer any pretense that Eleanor was simply a housekeeper, waiting to decide her next step. She was part of this. She had made herself part of it with documentation and legal filings, and by walking through a gap in a fence toward 4 armed men on horseback because it was necessary. She kept the records. She organized the evidence. She drafted a letter to a lawyer in Helena Caleb's idea, which surprised her, and which she executed carefully, laying out the situation in terms that a legal advocate could act on quickly if the commissioner's response came back needing support. She also kept cooking. She kept the garden. She taught Damon another failed biscuit lesson on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, and laughed properly for the first time since Missouri when he managed to produce something that was genuinely edible, though it required significant charity to call it a biscuit. The laugh surprised her. The ease of it surprised her even more. Caleb heard it from the main room and appeared in the kitchen doorway to find out what had happened. He took one look at the object on the baking sheet and at Damon's expression of cautious pride, and at Eleanor's face, which was still carrying the laughter. And something moved in his expression that he controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. She saw it. She looked away. She handed Damon the butter. The evening of the 15th day. After filing, they were on the porch again. They'd developed an evening habit of the porch coffee and quiet, and the mountain dark. When Caleb said with the careful deliberateness of a man who has chosen his moment, "My wife's name was Clara," Eleanor went very still. "She was from Kentucky," he said. "She wanted to come west. She was the one who found this land. I built the house and she had ideas about the garden." He stopped. "She'd have been glad about the garden." Eleanor didn't say anything. She understood with the precision of someone who had learned to read the spaces between his words that this was not a story being told lightly. This was something being given carefully to someone he'd decided could be trusted with it. "She sounds like someone worth grieving," Eleanor said finally. She was. His voice was quiet. I think I've been living like the grieving was the point. Like it was what I owed her." He looked out at the dark. "I'm starting to think she'd have had words about that." "What kind of words?" The edge of his mouth moved. "Clara had plenty of words, most of them direct." He looked at his coffee cup. "She would have liked you. She would have said something about how people who read everything and know about water law and walk toward trouble when they're frightened have no business going unappreciated." Eleanor's heart did something complicated. "I don't need," she started. "I know you don't need it," Caleb said. "But that's different from whether you deserve it." She had no answer for that. She sat with it the way she'd sat with the thing he'd said on the very first afternoon. It isn't charity. It's a room that was going to sit empty either way, the way she always sat with the things he said that required more space than a quick response could give them. They sat in the quiet for a long time, and then the sound came from the north, not close, but not far enough. The sound she had been trained in the weeks since the first fence confrontation to recognize immediately. Cattle. Moving fast. Moving wrong. Caleb was on his feet before Eleanor had fully processed what she was hearing. He had his hat and his rifle in the same motion, moving for the porch steps with the swift, contained purpose of a man who knew exactly what that sound meant. "Stay here," he said. Eleanor stood up. "Eleanor." "How many head are in the north pasture?" she said. 32. "And the creek diversion, if someone opened the upstream block they installed, the water would flood the lower field and push the cattle toward the ridge, wouldn't it?" She'd read the land survey documents twice. She knew the topography from paper, the way Caleb knew it from 11 years of walking it. "That's the move. That's what they're doing." He looked at her. His jaw was set, and his eyes were very clear in the dark. "If the cattle go over the ridge in the dark," she said, "you lose them, or enough of them." "Yes." "Then you need both of us." A beat. 2. "Can you ride?" he said. "Since I was 8. "Then ride," he said, and went for the horses. She went with him. The north pasture was a confusion of sound and movement. When they arrived, 32 cattle unsettled by water that had appeared where it shouldn't be, milling and pressing toward the ridge with the particular mindless momentum of animals that have decided to panic. Hector and Damon were already there, working the edges, trying to turn the herd back from the ridgeline. Eleanor didn't wait to be told what to do. She'd worked cattle exactly once in her life one summer, helping a neighbor in Missouri with a herd half this size. But she understood pressure and release. She understood the instinct of frightened animals, and she rode wide and fast around the left flank, with her horse moving under her with a sure-footedness she was grateful for, and she turned the leaders. The leaders turned. The herd wavered. Caleb was on the right flank, pressing the right edge back, and Hector was straight ahead, working the front, and for 20 minutes in the dark and the heat of a July night. The four of them moved the cattle away from the ridge with the focused physical intensity of people who are not thinking about anything except the problem directly in front of them. When the herd finally settled, pushed back into the center of the pasture, away from the flood and the ridge, Eleanor pulled her horse up and sat with her arms shaking from the effort, and her breath coming hard, and the quiet of a disaster narrowly prevented settling over all four of them. Caleb rode up beside her. He looked at her in the dark. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Hector's voice came from across the pasture. "Creek's been diverted again. Upstream. Someone got in there tonight." 32 head, Damon said, appearing on Eleanor's other side. "All present. Nothing over the ridge." Caleb didn't look away from Eleanor. "Add it to the record," he said, but he was saying it to her, not to the Cole brothers. "Already will," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked away across the settled herd, and Eleanor saw his jaw move, not with anger, she realized, but with something closer to resolution. The look of a man who has been patient long enough and has just reached a decision about how much longer patience serves him. "I'm going to Helena," he said. "In person, with everything we have." Eleanor looked at him. "When me, Monday." "Then I'm coming with you." He started to say something. "Caleb." She kept her voice level and her eyes on his. "You need someone who can speak to the documentation and the legal language of the prior claim. You need someone who's read everything and can answer questions in a commissioner's office without losing the thread when they push back." She held his gaze. "You need me there, and you know it." The night was very quiet around them. The cattle had settled. Hector and Damon were checking the creek line. The summer stars burned overhead the way they'd burned on her first night in this valley, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. Caleb looked at her for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. One word. But the way he said it, the simplicity of it, the same level honesty he brought to every true thing, carried considerably more weight than its single syllable suggested. They rode back in the dark side by side, not touching and not needing to. And behind them, the north pasture settled into the quiet of near-disaster resolved. What neither of them could know. Riding back to the house in the hot Montana dark was that Thomas Whitmore had been watching from the tree line, and that what he had seen Eleanor Hayes riding a flank in the dark, turning a panicked herd working beside Caleb Walker and the Cole brothers, with the competence of someone who had never once considered whether she belonged there, had produced in him not just anger, but something that was rarer and more dangerous. Fear, because Thomas Whitmore had spent weeks trying to push Caleb Walker off that land by making the land ungovernable. And what he had just seen in the dark of the north pasture was that the woman he had left on a platform with nothing had become the most capable thing on that ranch. He had rejected her for not being enough. He had not considered what she might become when she was given room to be what she already was. He drove back to his own ranch that night, and he sat in his large, well-furnished house, and he thought very carefully about what he needed to do next. And Eleanor Hayes, who did not know she was being watched and would not have changed a single thing she'd done if she had known, sat in the kitchen in the late hour and opened her record book and wrote down the date and the time and the method and the extent of the fourth diversion in the clear, precise hand that had been reading legal documents for 6 years against the day they might be useful. She wrote it all down, and she did not look up. They left for Helena before sunrise on Monday. Caleb had the strong box on the wagon seat between them. Land, grant papers, water rights documents, Eleanor's record of 4 diversions with dates and times, and witness signatures. The letter to the Helena lawyer that Eleanor had drafted and Caleb had signed, and a copy of the original territorial filing. Avery Birch had stamped and returned to them. Eleanor had spent Sunday night organizing everything into a sequence that told the story clearly and fast, because she had learned from her father's case that legal offices were full of tired men who needed the story told clearly and fast, or they stopped listening. She had it organized. She sat on the wagon seat in the pre-dawn dark with her hands folded in her lap and her mind running through the documents in sequence like a woman rehearsing lines. Except the lines were facts, and the stage was a commissioner's office, and what was at stake was a man's land and 11 years of work. Caleb drove. He did not talk much in the early hours, which she'd come to understand was not distance but concentration. He was a man who moved into serious things, quietly gathering himself. They were 2 hours out of Callow Creek when he said, "Tell me again what we lead with." "Prior claim date," Eleanor said without hesitation. "August 14, 1871. Whitmore's land purchase was March 1873. That establishes the legal hierarchy before anything else gets discussed. Everything else, the diversions, the witness accounts, the pattern, all of it supports a violation of an already established right. We're not asking the commissioner to decide a dispute. We're asking him to enforce something that was already decided in 1871. Caleb nodded slowly. "And if they push back on the documentation?" "They won't. 3 witnesses, 4 incidents dated and signed. That's more documentation than most water rights cases carry." She looked at him sideways. "What they might push back on is who compiled it. Meaning you. Meaning a woman who isn't a lawyer and wasn't an official party to the original claim." She kept her voice even. "If that comes up, the answer is that I'm the household manager of the Walker Ranch, and I compiled the record in that capacity. I'm not presenting myself as legal counsel. I'm presenting documented evidence. The evidence speaks regardless of who organized it." He looked at the road ahead. "You've thought about all of this." "I've been thinking about it since Friday night in the north pasture," she said. "I think better when I'm worried. It's not a quality I recommend, but it's what I have." That almost smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "It's working so far. Ask me again after we talk to the commissioner." Helena was a full day's drive. They stopped at midday at a way station where Eleanor bought bread and dried meat. With 2 of her $7, she still had them all 7 because Caleb refused to let her contribute to provisions, and she'd stopped arguing about it the 3rd time, but she had decided the trip to Helena was her expense, and that was not negotiable. She handed him his portion of the food without comment, and he took it without comment, and they ate on the wagon seat, watching the horses rest, and not talking about the fact that this was the farthest she'd been from the ranch since the day she arrived. "Tell me about your father's case," Caleb said. Eleanor looked at him. It wasn't a question she'd expected. "Why?" "Because you know things about land law that most people don't," he said, "and I'd like to understand where they come from. And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because we have a long drive, and I find I want to know." She sat with that for a moment. "I find I want to know." said plainly without apology, the way he said all true things. His name was John Hayes, she said. He had 40 acres in Buchanan County, Missouri. Good land, creek running through the southeast corner that watered the lower field. A man named Forsyth bought the adjacent property in 1869 and spent 3 years trying to acquire my father's water access because it was the only reliable water source for a significant stretch of that area. She looked at her hands. Forsyth was connected. Money, local political standing, a lawyer in St. Joseph who'd won 40 cases before he lost one. My father had himself and whatever he could read and afford. What happened? Forsyth's lawyer found a technical defect in the original water rights, filing a surveyor's notation that was ambiguous about the creek's exact course. It shouldn't have been enough to invalidate the claim. But it gave Forsyth's people room to argue, and they had more time and money to argue it than my father did. And eventually the case went to a judge who was either corrupt or simply tired of it, and my father lost. She was quiet for a moment. He kept the land. But without the water access, the lower field was useless. He spent the last 2 years of his life farming half what he should have been farming. Caleb said nothing for a while. "You're filing," Eleanor said. "I checked the surveyor's notation 3 times. It's clean. The creek course is unambiguous." She looked at him directly. "I wasn't going to let that happen twice." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the road, and she saw his jaw move in that way it did when something had gotten past his careful exterior and he was deciding what to do about it. "Your father," he said, "would be proud of you." Eleanor looked away fast. She did not say anything for several miles. They reached Helena in the late afternoon and found a boarding house where Eleanor took one room and Caleb took another, and neither of them made anything of the arrangement. They ate supper in the common room, a decent meal better than Eleanor had expected, and went over the documents one final time at the table before the other boarders needed it for the evening. The Territorial Commissioner's office opened at 8 o'clock. They were there at 10 minutes to 8. The office was run by a man named Commissioner Gerald Oakes, who turned out to be not tired-looking at all, but sharp in the way of someone who has processed a great many land disputes and developed very quick instincts about which ones were serious. He was perhaps 60, with the careful economy of movement of a man who had learned that wasted motion produced wasted time, and he looked at Eleanor when they were shown in with the particular look of a man recalibrating his expectations of the meeting. "Mr. Walker," he said. "And this is Eleanor Hayes," Eleanor said. "I manage the household of the Walker Ranch. I also compiled the documentation we're presenting today." Oakes looked at her for one more assessing second. Then he sat down and held out his hand for the papers. Eleanor gave him the prior claim document first. He read it. He looked at the date. He looked up. August 1871. "Yes," Eleanor said. "The adjacent land currently owned by Thomas Whitmore was purchased in March 1873. The creek that feeds the north pasture of the Walker property was established as a water access right under this claim before Whitmore held any title to neighboring land." Oakes set the document down carefully. "Go on." She gave him the diversion record next. He read it the way people read things they're taking seriously, slowly, going back checking dates against each other. He read Hector Cole's account. He read Damon Cole's account. He read the time Eleanor had compiled that laid the 4 incidents against the dates of Whitmore's written purchase offers, which she had obtained copies of from Avery Birch's office. That last page made him stop. "These offers," he said. "The timing. The first diversion occurred 11 days after Mr. Walker declined the first purchase offer," Eleanor said. "The second occurred 6 days after the second offer was declined. The third and fourth followed the filing of our preliminary complaint with Mr. Birch's office." She kept her voice level and her hands still. "The pattern suggests the diversions are not incidental." Oakes looked at Caleb. "Mr. Walker, is there anything you want to add to what Miss Hayes has presented?" Caleb had been quiet through the whole presentation, which Eleanor had understood was intentional. He was letting the document speak, letting her speak, not interrupting either. "She's presented it accurately," he said. "I'd add that I've been on that land 11 years, and the creek has never naturally diverted in any of those incidents' locations. The geology doesn't support it." "You're certain?" I know my land, Caleb said simply. Oakes sat back. He looked at the papers spread across his desk for a long moment, and the particular quality of his silence told Eleanor things that his words hadn't yet. This was the silence of someone who had reached a conclusion and was arranging how to state it. I'm going to be direct with you, Oakes said. What you've brought me today is one of the cleaner cases of water rights interference I've seen in this office. The prior claim date is solid. The pattern of harassment is documented in a way that most complainants can't manage. And the correlation between the purchase offer rejections and the diversion incidents. He tapped the timeline page. That correlation is going to be very difficult for Mr. Whitmore's legal representation to explain away. Eleanor felt something release in her chest. She kept her face still. What happens next? Caleb asked. I issue a formal cease and desist order against any further interference with the creek on Whitmore's property, Oakes said. That goes out this week. I also open a formal investigation into the 4 documented incidents. If the investigation confirms what this documentation suggests, and I have no reason to doubt it will, we'll be looking at potential penalties under territorial water law. He looked at Eleanor directly. Who drafted the legal framing in this presentation, Miss Hayes? The prior claim argument is, it's structured very specifically. I read a great deal of territorial law, Eleanor said. My father had a water rights case in Missouri. I've been reading legal proceedings since I was 19. Oakes studied her for a moment. Then he said with a dryness that was as close to warmth as his professional manner seemed to go. You might consider making that reading professionally applicable, Miss Hayes. You're wasting it on household management. Eleanor thought of her father's 40 acres. She thought of the 6 years and the judge who was either corrupt or tired. She thought of standing on a train platform with her knuckles white around a worn leather suitcase. I'm not wasting it, she said. They walked out of the commissioner's office into the July morning with a stamped acknowledgement of their filing and Oakes's verbal commitment to the cease and desist order. And Eleanor stood on the boardwalk and breathed the Helena air and felt the specific, complicated relief of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. Caleb stood beside her. You did that, he said. We did that. Your land grant was clean. Your 11 years of work built the foundation. Eleanor. He said it quietly, and it stopped her. You did that. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that open expression the gate left unlatched, the thing behind his eyes that wasn't controlled the way everything else about him was controlled. All right, she said. We both did. He almost argued. Then he didn't. He looked out at the street instead and said in a different register, I'd like to buy you dinner tonight. A proper dinner, not boarding house food. She looked at him. That's not necessary. It isn't necessary, he agreed. I'd like to. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said again. They ate at a restaurant on the main street of Helena. A real restaurant with tablecloths and a menu written on a chalkboard and food that was genuinely good, though. Eleanor spent half the meal thinking she could have done better with the sauce on the roasted chicken. She didn't say so. She was working on keeping her professional assessments to herself in social contexts with mixed results. Caleb ordered wine, which surprised her. He poured it carefully, and he raised his glass and he said, To your father. Eleanor's breath caught. She raised her glass. They drank. Tell me something about him, Caleb said. Not the case. Him. Eleanor thought for a moment. He used to read the land survey maps the way some men read scripture, like the information on them was sacred almost. The topography, the watercourses. He'd spread them out on the kitchen table after supper and just trace them with his finger planning what he was going to do with every acre. She looked at her glass. He never got to do most of it, but the planning made him happy. He was a man who needed to believe the future was going to be better than the present. Were you like him? I used to be. She was quiet for a moment. I stopped for a while, believing the future would be better. She looked up. I've started again recently. Caleb looked at her across the table. I didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The thing between them that had been building for weeks, that accumulation of mornings and evenings and fence lines and document pages and a dark pasture and a long drive and a commissioner's office where she had laid out the case for his land with everything her father had taught her, was present at that table as clearly as the tablecloth and the wine and the candlelight, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved toward it yet. But they both knew it. They drove home the next morning and arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon to find Hector and Damon waiting on the porch with expressions that said something had happened. Eleanor was off the wagon before it fully stopped. "What?" she said. Hector looked at Caleb. "Whitmore was here yesterday." Caleb went very still. "Here, on the ranch. Rode up in the afternoon. Alone, no Reeves, no hired men, just him." Hector's voice was careful. "He asked for Miss Hayes." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. "He asked for," Caleb started. "He said he'd heard she'd gone to Helena with the land filing," Hector said. He said he wanted to speak to her directly. I told him she wasn't here. He said he'd come back." The three of them looked at Eleanor. She thought about Thomas Whitmore watching from the tree line during the night herd incident. She thought about him recalculating. She thought about what it meant that he'd come alone without Reeves and asked for her specifically. "He's not coming to threaten," she said. "He's coming to negotiate." "With you," Damon said. "He thinks," she worked through it, "he thinks I'm the leverage. He rejected me on that platform, and I'm the one who built the case against him, and now he thinks if he comes to me directly offers something he can change the outcome." She looked at Caleb. "He doesn't understand that I'm not here in the capacity he thinks I'm here in." Caleb's expression had gone very quiet. "What capacity does he think you're in?" Eleanor met his eyes. "Someone who can be bought, or persuaded. Someone whose position here is temporary, conditional." She held his gaze. "Someone who doesn't have a stake." The quiet between them had a different quality than their usual quiet. "He's wrong," Caleb said. 2 words. But the weight behind them pressed through Eleanor's chest like something warm and physical and real. "Yes," she said. "He is." Whitmore came back the next morning. He rode up alone, exactly as Hector had described. And he tied his horse at the post, and he stood at the bottom of the porch steps, and he took his hat off, and he held it in his hands, the way men held hats when they were attempting to look humble and weren't entirely certain they remembered how. Eleanor came out onto the porch. Caleb was at her shoulder. She hadn't asked him to be there. He simply was. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Miss Hayes." He looked at her with the full attention that he had withheld so completely on the train platform, and she recognized it for what it was. Not admiration, but assessment. He was measuring what she'd become. What she was now standing on this porch in front of this house. He was running the numbers, and the numbers were not what he'd expected. "I wonder if we might speak privately." "You can say what you've come to say here," Eleanor said. A flicker of something irritation recalculation. He absorbed it. "The filing in Helena," he said. "I understand you were instrumental in its preparation." "I was." "I also understand that Commissioner Oakes is expected to rule in Walker's favor on the water rights question." He said it flatly, a man acknowledging a fact he doesn't like. "My lawyer reviewed the documentation. He says the prior claim date it's solid." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "There are ways," he said carefully, "that this situation could be resolved to everyone's benefit without a formal ruling. Compensation for the incidents. A renegotiation of the water access terms that would be mutually—" "No," Caleb said. Whitmore looked past Eleanor at Caleb. "Mr. Walker, I'm trying to offer you a resolution that avoids. You spent 8 weeks trying to push me off my land," Caleb said. His voice was level and absolute. "You sent men to my fence line. You diverted my water 4 times. And you're standing here now because the legal ground shifted under you and you'd like to find a way out that doesn't go on your record." He took 1 step forward. "There isn't one." Whitmore's jaw tightened. He looked back at Eleanor. "Miss Hayes, surely you can see that—" "Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor kept her voice calm and her eyes on his. When you left me on that platform in July, you made a decision about what I was worth. I've spent the months since then making a different decision about it myself." She held his gaze without difficulty. "The filing stands. The investigation continues. And whatever Commissioner Oakes determines based on the evidence is what will happen. I'm not a variable you can adjust." He stared at her, and Eleanor watched him understand slowly, visibly, in the specific way of a man whose power relies on other people being uncertain about their own, that there was nothing available to him here. Not leverage, and not negotiation, and not the particular vulnerability of someone who could be reminded that they arrived with nothing and could leave the same way. Because she had arrived with nothing and built something, and the building was solid, and Thomas Whitmore had not been part of it. "This isn't over," he said, but the words had the sound of habit, the thing men said when they had nothing else left to say. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "It is." He put his hat back on. He went back to his horse. He rode out of the Walker Ranch without looking back, and Eleanor stood on the porch and watched him go with her hands loose at her sides, and her heart very steady, and something that felt almost like the end of a long-held breath releasing. Caleb stood beside her. When Whitmore was out of sight, she said, "He'll comply with the cease and desist. He doesn't have a choice, but he'll sell the Northland within the year. He won't want it anymore." "Probably. You should be ready to make an offer when it comes." Caleb turned and looked at her. "You're planning ahead. Someone has to." She looked out at the road where Whitmore had gone. "The north acreage adjacent to yours has a secondary water source that your land survey shows, but your current claim doesn't use. If you acquire it, you can graze another 20 head and have redundant water access that nobody can divert without coming onto land you own outright." She paused. "Your father-in-law might want to reconsider the timber portion, though. I haven't read—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. I keep—" "Don't stop," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Don't stop," he said again. "Thinking ahead. Planning it." He was looking at her with that open expression, the unlatched gait, the thing that had been building for weeks and was fully present now in the afternoon summer light on the porch of the house he'd built for 2 people and lived in alone for 9 years. "Clara used to do that. Plan the land. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. Someone planning a future on this ground." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Caleb, I'm not asking you to be Clara," he said quietly and directly, which was how he said everything that mattered. "I'm not asking you to be anything except exactly what you already are, but I want you to know that what you already are—" He stopped, found the words. "What you already are is the reason this land still has water, and the reason that house has been warm every morning for 3 months, and the reason I've been planning again." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what the right words are for that. I'm a man who spent 11 years not needing to find them, but I wanted you to know." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the train platform. She thought about the letter that said a good woman like you deserves a proper home. She thought about how she'd read those words and wanted to believe them, and then stood in the wreckage of believing them, and been offered instead a room with a bolt on the door, and a man who said, it's a room that was going to sit empty either way. She thought about how the empty room had not stayed empty, how neither of them had. "I came west for a different life," she said slowly. "I thought I knew what it would look like. I had a very specific picture." She met his eyes. "I was completely wrong about the picture, but I think—" She stopped. Let the thought complete itself. "I think I was right about the feeling, what I wanted the life to feel like." She looked at him. "It feels like this." Caleb was very still. Then he reached out, and he took her hand, not dramatically, not suddenly, but the way he did everything with careful, deliberate intention, like a man who means what he does and does what he means. His hand was warm and work-roughened, and it held hers with the same steadiness that was in everything about him, and Eleanor did not pull away. She looked out from the porch at the ranch, the barn, the pasture, the mountains going blue with afternoon distance, and she felt with the precision of something finally named that she was standing on land that had been fought for with documentation and water rights law, and a sleepless night in a north pasture, and that the fight had been hers as much as his, and that this place knew her name. From behind them inside the house, Damon's voice floated out through the open window. Hector. Do you think she'd teach me biscuits again tonight? I'm getting better. I think I'm genuinely getting better. Hector's voice patient as stone. Damon, you burned the last 3. The last 2. The first one was just very brown. Eleanor laughed. Caleb turned his head at the sound of it, and the expression on his face was the same one she'd caught in the kitchen doorway 3 weeks ago, and looked away from, because she hadn't been ready to know what it meant. She didn't look away this time. Damon burned the biscuits again the next morning. Eleanor didn't say anything about it. She simply moved him aside, gently showed him for the 4th time how to test the heat of the pan with the back of his hand before the fat went in, and handed him the spoon with the particular patience of someone who has decided that a person trying is worth more than a person who has stopped. You're not angry, Damon said, watching her fix what he'd ruined. Why would I be angry? Because I keep doing it wrong. You keep doing it, Eleanor said. That's different from doing it wrong. She handed him back the spoon. Again, you finish it. Hector appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the situation, and wisely went to pour his own coffee without comment. Caleb came in a few minutes later, registered the smell of something recently rescued from disaster, caught Eleanor's eye, and also said nothing, which was one of the things about him that she had come to appreciate unreasonably. The morning moved the way. Mornings on the ranch moved now with the easy overlapping rhythm of 4 people who had learned each other's schedules and silences and particular requirements. Hector needed coffee before he could be spoken to. Damon needed to be spoken to immediately, or he filled the silence with observations that went in directions nobody had planned for. Caleb moved through the morning the way he moved through everything deliberately without waste. And Eleanor had her own rhythm that had threaded itself into the household's rhythm so naturally that she couldn't now identify where one ended and the other began. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She wasn't sure it mattered. What mattered was the letter that arrived from Helena on Thursday. Avery Birch brought it out personally from Callow Creek, which told her before she'd opened it that it was significant. He handed it to Caleb on the porch with a look that was carefully professional over something that might have been satisfaction. Commissioner Oakes's ruling, Birch said, came in this morning. Caleb looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the envelope. Open it, she said. He opened it. He read it. His face didn't do very much while he was reading, which was normal for him, and which meant nothing about the content. Eleanor waited with her hands still and her breathing even, and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then he lowered the letter and looked at her. We won, he said. The words were so simple. 2 words the same way he said everything important directly without performance. Eleanor took the letter from him and read it herself because she needed to see the specific language. Commissioner Oakes had found in Walker's favor on all points. The prior claim date had been upheld without qualification. The 4 documented diversions had been ruled deliberate interference with an established water right. Thomas Whitmore was ordered to pay restitution for damages to the North Pasture grazing capacity across the period of interference. A formal cease and desist was issued with penalties specified for any future violation. The ruling was filed with the territorial record and would stand as precedent. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and handed it back to Caleb. Your father's case, Birch said, looking at Eleanor with a directness that told her he knew more about the Helena proceedings than just what was in the envelope. Commissioner Oakes mentioned in his correspondence to my office that the quality of the documentation was his word was exceptional. He asked me to convey that. Eleanor looked at the letter in Caleb's hand. Tell Commissioner Oakes, she said after a moment, that the documentation was in memory of John Hayes of Buchanan County, Missouri. He would have appreciated knowing it was useful. Birch nodded. He put his hat back on. He rode back toward Callow Creek, and the 3 of them, Caleb and Eleanor and Hector, who had appeared from the barn at some point during the exchange, stood on the porch in the July morning with the ruling in Caleb's hand, and something large and quiet settling over all of them. Hector took his hat off. He held it against his chest. He didn't say anything, which was how she knew he was moved. Damon appeared from the kitchen, still holding the biscuit spoon, and said, "Did we win?" "We won," Hector said. Damon raised the spoon. Eleanor laughed again, a real one, full and unguarded, and it rang out across the yard, and Caleb turned his head at the sound of it, the same way he had on the porch 2 days ago, when she'd stopped looking away. "We need to celebrate," Damon announced. "I'll make biscuits." "You will absolutely not make biscuits," Hector said. "I'm getting better." "Damon." Eleanor was still laughing when she went back inside to start breakfast. Caleb followed her, not immediately, but after a moment, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, the way he'd stood there on her first evening when she'd put the cloth on the table, and he'd said, "That's the best biscuit I've had in 11 years. Except this time, he didn't look like a man recalibrating his expectations of an unexpected guest. He looked like a man standing in his own kitchen, watching someone he had chosen. "Eleanor," he said. "I know," she said. She was already at the stove, already moving because her hands needed something to do when her heart was this full. "I know." "Do you?" She turned around. He was looking at her with the gate fully open, no careful distance, no controlled steadiness, just the thing itself plainly present. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and he took her face in his hands. Those warm, work-roughened, careful hands. And he looked at her for one moment, the way he looked at everything that mattered, with full deliberate attention, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a dramatic thing. It was a quiet thing, the way all the truest moments between them had been quiet, certain, and unhurried, and exactly what it was without pretending to be anything else. When he pulled back, his hands were still on her face. "I have been," he said, "trying to find the right moment for that for approximately 6 weeks. "You could have found it sooner," she said. "I know." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'm a slow man." "No," Eleanor said. "You're a careful one." She put her hands over his. "There's a difference." Outside, Damon's voice floated in. "Hector, do you think they're Hector?" "Hector, I think they might be." "Damon." Hector's voice was patient and final. "Go check the south fence." "But..." "Now, Damon." Eleanor was still smiling when Caleb kissed her again, and that was how the Walker Ranch kitchen became on an ordinary Thursday in August of 1883, a place where something that had been missing for 9 years came quietly and completely home. The weeks that followed had their own particular quality, not the urgency of the crisis period, not the careful formality of the early days, but something new and unhurried. The texture of a life being built deliberately by people who knew the cost of things falling apart and were paying close attention to keep them together. Caleb began talking to Eleanor about the land, the way her father had talked about it, spreading the survey maps on the kitchen table after supper, pointing to sections, asking her opinion. Not because he needed her to read the maps for him, but because he had remembered apparently what it felt like to plan with someone and had decided he didn't want to stop again. She gave opinions freely. He took them seriously. They disagreed twice in the first week, once about the timing of a fence repair on the south boundary, once about whether to add a second root cellar before winter, and both disagreements were conducted with the directness that was. She was discovering the particular grammar of how they talked to each other when something mattered. No softening, no deflection. Just the two positions stated, plainly examined, honestly resolved by whoever made the better argument. The first time they disagreed seriously, and she won the argument. Caleb was quiet for a moment, and then said, "You're right. Just that. No caveat, no qualification." Eleanor had spent 26 years in a world where men said you might have a point when they meant you're right, and let me think about it when they meant I've decided to ignore you. The directness of "you're right" hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force that was entirely disproportionate to the words. "I know," she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. He looked at her sideways. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly fine," she said. "Go fix the fence." He went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and breathed. The south fence got repaired on her timeline. The second root cellar got started the following week. By September, the north pasture had fully recovered its grazing capacity. The cattle count was holding strong at 62 calves born in August that Eleanor had named without asking permission, and nobody had objected, and the Walker Ranch was running with an efficiency that Hector Cole, who was not a man given to unsolicited observation, called "the best this place has run since I started here" in Eleanor's hearing, and then looked mildly embarrassed about the compliment. She received it with grace. She was learning to receive things with grace. It was harder than it sounded for a woman who had spent most of her life making sure she never needed anything from anyone. The twist that changed everything arrived not from Helena, or from Whitmore's diminished operation to the north, but from Missouri. It arrived in a letter forwarded from Callow Creek in her youngest brother's handwriting. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in mid-September, and the color went out of her face fast enough that Caleb, who was at the other end of the table with his coffee and the ranch accounts, looked up immediately. "What happened?" he said. "Not a question." "My mother," Eleanor said. She read the letter again. Her brother Daniel's words were simple, and 19-year-old boy blunt, the way he'd always been Mama's worse. "Doctor says she won't make it to spring. She's asking for you, Eleanor. We all are." She set the letter on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. "I have to go back," she said. The words came out of her before she'd fully decided them, because they were simply true, the way some things were simply true. "I have to go home." Caleb set down his coffee. Eleanor looked at the letter on the table, and then at her hands, and then at the window, and then because there was nowhere else honest to look at him. "I don't know how long. Daniel says she might have months. She might have weeks. I don't—" She stopped. Her voice was doing something she didn't like. "I don't know." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll drive you to the station." "Caleb, your mother is asking for you," he said. "There isn't anything to discuss." She looked at him. In his face, she found exactly what she should have known. She'd find no hesitation, no calculation, no cost-benefit accounting of what her leaving meant for the household, or the ranch, or the particular new and fragile and real thing between them. Just the same steadiness he brought to every true and difficult thing. "I don't know when I'll be back," she said. "I know. I might need to—" She stopped again. There were arrangements to be made, possibly about her brothers, about the property, about things she couldn't predict from here. "I can't promise you a timeline." "Eleanor." He said her name the way he'd first said it, quietly, with weight. "Go to your mother." "The household?" "Hector and I managed a household before you came," he said. "We managed it badly, and the garden was a disaster, and the biscuits were criminal, but we managed. We'll be here when you come back." "When you come back, not if." She looked at him for a long moment, with something pressing hard behind her eyes that she was not going to allow to become tears in this kitchen on a Wednesday morning. "You're certain," she said. "I've been certain about very few things in my life," Caleb said, and his voice was the quietest she'd ever heard it, "but I'm certain about that." She left on Friday. Caleb drove her to the station in Callow Creek, the same station where 4 months ago she'd arrived with a worn leather suitcase and $7 and a hope she'd been too proud to let anyone see crumble. It was a different morning from that one. September cool instead of July. Blazing, the mountains changed from summer to their first hints of gold. Her hand on the same suitcase that had traveled 300 miles west and was now traveling back with considerably more in it than it had carried the first time. Hector and Damon had both come to see her off, which she hadn't expected, and which required her to deploy significant discipline to manage gracefully. Hector had shaken her hand with both of his very firmly and said nothing which she understood was his highest form of expression. Damon had hugged her without warning, and then stepped back looking embarrassed and said, "You'll come back, right? Because I was finally getting better at the biscuits." "You were not," Eleanor said. "I was. That last batch was edible, barely." "That's progress," he said with enormous dignity. She laughed. She hugged him back properly, which made him stand very straight and try to look casual about it. At the station, Caleb carried her suitcase to the platform. He set it down beside her. He stood in front of her with his hat in his hands, which she had come to understand was the tell the gesture that meant he was in serious territory, hat in hands, not on his head. And he looked at her with the full, steady attention that she had come to understand was his version of saying everything at once. "Write to me," he said. "I will." "Tell me how she is." "I will. Tell me." He stopped. Found what he was looking for. Tell me what you need. From here. Whatever you need, I'll send it. Eleanor looked at him standing on that platform in Callow Creek, with his hat in his hands, and the September light on his face, and 9 years of a house kept empty behind him, and 62 cattle and 2,000 acres, and a north pasture that still had water, because she had read her father's land survey documents and paid attention, and she felt something clarify in her chest with the cleanness of a thing finally completely understood. I need to know this is here, she said. When I come back, I need to know this is here. It's here, Caleb said. I'm here. She picked up her suitcase, then she put it back down, and she stepped forward, and she put her arms around him, not waiting for him to reach for her, not making it a question, just deciding and doing the way she'd decided and done everything in the last 4 months, and he put his arms around her with the care of a man holding something he intends to keep safe. And they stood on that platform in front of whatever was left of Callow Creek's opinion of them, and neither of them cared. The train came. She got on it. She watched him through the window as the platform receded, hat back on standing straight, the particular quality of stillness that was entirely him, until the train took a long curve, and the station disappeared, and Eleanor Hayes turned forward in her seat, and looked at the country opening up ahead of her and breathed. She was going home. She was also leaving it. Both of those things were true at once, and she held them both, and did not try to make one of them less true to make the other more comfortable. Her mother was alive when she arrived in Hester, Missouri, which was the thing that let Eleanor breathe properly for the first time since Daniel's letter. Frail and tired and diminished from the woman Eleanor remembered but present. And when Eleanor came through the door of the small house where she'd grown up, her mother opened her eyes and said, "There she is," with a certainty that suggested she had never doubted the arrival, only the timing. "Here I am," Eleanor said, and took her mother's hand. She stayed 6 weeks. She wrote to Caleb every week, sometimes twice. She told him about her mother's good days the afternoon she sat up in bed and asked for pie and ate 2 slices. The morning she told Eleanor a story about Eleanor's father that Eleanor had never heard before. Something about a dance at a county fair in 1852, and a blue dress and a man who had been very nervous and tried to hide it behind extreme confidence. She told him about the harder days. She told him about her brothers Daniel and young Thomas, who were 19 and 16 and trying to manage the farm and the house, and their mother's illness, with the particular combination of effort and incompetence of boys who needed more practice at things they'd been thrown into too fast. She stayed 6 weeks, and she organized the farm accounts and repaired the kitchen roof with Daniel's help, and taught Thomas to cook 4 things that would sustain him through winter, and she sat with her mother every evening, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and either way was enough. Caleb wrote back to every letter. His letters were like him, direct, and not long, but never sparse, saying exactly what he meant. He told her the biscuit situation had deteriorated significantly in her absence. He told her the second root cellar was done, and he'd put the winter provisions in it, and thought of her organizational system when he was arranging things, because her organizational system was objectively better than his. He told her the north pasture was holding. He told her the 2 August calves, the ones she'd named Liberty and June names, he said he'd objected to, and then stopped objecting to, because they were clearly already named, were thriving. He told her in the 4th letter that Whitmore's Northland had come up for sale, as she'd predicted it would. He was considering making an offer. Did she want to look at the survey before he decided? She wrote back, "Yes, save the survey for me. I'll look at it when I'm home." She reread what she'd written. Then she folded the letter and sent it without changing the word. Her mother died on a Thursday morning in early October, peacefully holding Eleanor's hand, having had pie twice the previous week, and the story of the blue dress and the county fair told back to her by Eleanor, who had memorized it. She died the way she had lived, without complaint and without drama, with the particular dignity of a woman who had decided a long time ago what she valued and had spent her life consistent with that decision. Eleanor sat with her for a while after. Then she got up and she went to find her brothers, and she told them what needed to be said, and she held them while they needed holding, and when she was done doing those things, she went into the kitchen and she made biscuits. Her biscuits, the ones that lived in her hands, because there are worse things to do when grief is sitting heavy than feed people who need feeding. Daniel came into the kitchen while she was working and leaned in the doorway, the same way Caleb leaned in. Doorways which made her throat tighten unexpectedly and said, "What are you going to do? Eleanor? Are you? Are you coming back here?" Eleanor looked at the dough under her hands. "No," she said, quietly but without hesitation. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Is it that ranch, the one you write about?" "Yes." "The man. Him too." She looked at her brother. "You'll be all right, Daniel. You and Thomas. You know what needs doing and you do it. That's enough to start with." She went back to the dough. "I'll send money when I can. I'll write. And you're welcome there, both of you, if you ever want to come west." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is he good to you?" Eleanor thought about the letter that said, "When you come back." The hand that had held hers on the porch. The commissioner's office in Helena. The 8 words that had mattered more than any of Thomas Whitmore's careful letters. "What you already are is the reason this land still has water." "Yes," she said. "He's good to me." She left for Montana on a Saturday 1 week after her mother's passing with her father's suitcase and the small collection of things she'd brought from Hester. A photograph, her mother's sewing kit, her father's land survey maps, which Daniel had pressed on her, saying, "You'll use them better than we will," and the clear, uncluttered sense of a woman who knows exactly where she's going and has decided not to be surprised about wanting to get there. The train west was nothing like the train east had been. 4 months ago, she'd sat facing away from home and toward a promise that turned out to be an assessment. Now she sat facing toward a place she'd earned the right to call home by staying when she had no reason to, beyond her own decision, and by working when nobody asked her to, and by walking through a fence gap toward 4 armed men, because the alternative was unacceptable. She watched the country change through the window. Rolling Missouri hills, giving way to flatland, giving way to the rising, roughening terrain of the territories, and she was calm in a way she hadn't been on the first journey. Not the false calm of someone suppressing fear, but the real kind, the kind that comes from knowing what you're doing and why. She arrived in Callow Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The station was quiet. October in Montana was a different creature from July. The air had an edge to it the mountains, showing their first serious snow above the timberline. She stepped onto the platform with her suitcase and her coat, and her heart doing something that was not exactly nervous, but was paying very close attention. She didn't have to look far. Caleb was there. I was standing at the far end of the platform, not in the middle, not dramatically positioned, just there, the way he was always just there when it mattered, tall and still, and wearing his good coat instead of his work coat, which she recognized as the specific effort he would make and not comment on. He saw her the same moment she saw him. He crossed the platform without hurrying. She walked toward him. They met in the middle with the unconscious accuracy of people who have been finding each other across distances. He took her suitcase. He looked at her face carefully, the way he looked at everything that mattered, reading what 6 weeks had done to it. "How are you?" he said. "She went peacefully," Eleanor said. "She had pie the week before." Something moved in his face. "Good. She heard about you," Eleanor said. "In my letters," she said. She stopped, smiled a small one. She said, "Any man who sends a woman to her dying mother without making it complicated is worth keeping." Caleb's expression did the thing it sometimes did when she surprised him. "Your mother was a perceptive woman," he said. "She was." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Welcome home, Eleanor." 2 words she had never been given plainly, without qualification, without the implication that the welcome was conditional on something she had yet to prove. She had proved everything she intended to prove. "Thank you," she said, "for being here. There wasn't anywhere else to be." They drove back to the ranch in the October afternoon, the horses knowing the road so well they barely needed direction, and Eleanor sat on the wagon seat with the familiar motion of it settling into her bones like something recognized and said, "Tell me about the Whitmore land survey. What does the eastern boundary look like?" Caleb reached behind the seat and produced a rolled survey map with the particular deliberateness of a man who had been carrying it around for 2 weeks, waiting for this specific conversation. Eleanor took it. She unrolled it across her knees. She looked at the eastern boundary. She looked at the secondary water source she'd noted in the original survey months ago. "You should make the offer," she said. "That's what I thought," he said. "The eastern section has better drainage than the western. If you're going to graze another 20 head, you want them on the eastern side." "Also what I thought. You didn't need me to look at this." "No," he said. "I wanted you to." She looked at him sideways. He looked at the road ahead, with the almost smile that had become in 4 months as familiar to her as anything she'd known for 26 years. She rolled the map back up. She held it in her lap for the rest of the drive. The ranch appeared through the trees, and Eleanor felt it before she saw it fully, the pull of a place that has learned your presence and adjusted to include you, the way good land adjusts to a person who works it honestly. The barn, the porch, the kitchen window where the late afternoon light was doing something warm. Hector was at the fence line. He saw them coming and raised one hand, not waving, just acknowledging the Hector Cole version of a welcome home party. Damon came out of the barn at a run. "She's back," he called to no one in particular, to everyone in general. "Hector, she's back. Ma'am, we've had a biscuit situation. I want to report that it's not as bad as it sounds." "Damon," Eleanor said, climbing down from the wagon. "Show me." He showed her. It was in fact not as bad as it sounded. It was worse, but she kept that to herself because the attempt was there, and the attempt mattered. She was home. That evening after supper, she found herself at the kitchen table, with the familiar cup of coffee and the record book she'd kept through the summer's crisis, and Caleb across from her with his accounts. The two of them working in the same room, the way they'd learned to work each in their own thread present to the other, without requiring anything of that presence, except that it continue. She opened the record book to a fresh page. At the top she wrote the date, October 21st, 1883. Below it she wrote North Pasture Water Access, secured by territorial ruling August. Eastern Boundary Survey, under review for acquisition. Winter provisions complete. Second root cellar operational. Herd count 62 head. She looked at what she'd written. Then she added in the same plain hand she used for all official records, Walker Ranch household fully established. Future under active planning. Caleb looked up from his accounts. He read the page from across the table. He looked at her. Under active planning, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at the page again. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, steady, certain, deliberate, and he said, Then let's plan. Outside, the October wind moved through the Montana dark, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and the north pasture held its water, and the two calves named Liberty and June slept in the barn, while Damon lost an argument with Hector about the biscuits, and the second root cellar held enough provisions to carry all of them through whatever winter brought. Eleanor Hayes had come west on the promise of a man who looked at her and saw what was missing. She had stayed for a man who looked at her and saw what was there. And what was there, what had always been there, waiting for someone with the patience and the honesty and the simple human decency to look, was more than enough to build a life on. More than enough to build a legacy. More than enough to fill a house that had been empty for far too long and make it finally, completely, and without qualification, a home.